Linha, can I start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fourth session of the GEM webinar series 2023. For those who don't know me, my name is Marie-Noëlle Wallaise. I am a research officer at AFD in Paris and in charge of the GEM Vietnam project. So today we have the pleasure to welcome Clara Julien. She's a PhD student in urban studies and geography at University Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne in France. And she will present her work on migration as adaptation in the Mekong Delta. This presentation corresponds to the focus 7 in the Mekong Special Report of the GEM project published last year on the occasion of COP27. Her presentation will last about 30 minutes, and then we will have about 10-15 minutes of discussion on the main findings of this research by Sylvie Fanchette. So Sylvie Fanchette is a geographer and research director at IRD, working on vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies to environmental changes of people living in deltas. And after this discussion time, we will open the discussion to the rest of the audience. So you can, of course, ask question in the in the chat during the presentation. Please feel free to do it. And then for the discussion part with the audience, you can also raise your hand and we will allow you to speak through your microphone. So thank you very much for being here. And I leave the floor to Clara.
Thank you, Marie-Noëlle. Thank you very much for the introduction. I will now share my screen. So here, and put it full screen. That should be working. So thank you very much for receiving me here today and for attending.
Not yet full screen. Yeah, okay,
no?
Perfect.
No,
yeah, it's okay.
Yes?
Please go on. Yeah.
Yes, it was just a slight delay. So thank you very much for attending that session. And I'm really glad to have the chance to present my contribution to the Mekong Delta Emergency Report. As Marie-Noëlle mentioned in her introduction, I work about migration as adaptation. I am a PhD student at Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. And today I'll be presenting the results from the fieldwork I conducted in Vietnam. So first, I would like to recall a few basic data about the Mekong Delta from the social economic perspective. So as you know, the Mekong Delta is home to 17.3 million people in 2019. That is 18% of the national population on around 12% of the country's total surface area. The Mekong Delta has a relatively high population density compared to the national average, even though it's much lower than its counterpart in the northern part of the country, the Red River Delta. And it also has a relatively slow urbanization rate, since it has around 1% of annual increase of urban populations between 2009 and 2019 that lead to around 25% of urban population on the last census, which is much less than the national rate. Second aspect of introduction is what we vastly discussed in last week's session, that that Mekong Delta is the rice bowl of Vietnam, with more than half of the rice production of the country, mainly for exportation. And it represents almost 50% of the country's cereal planted surface area, more than half of the paddy planted surface area, and 3/4 of the aquaculture surface area. In that specific context, the anthropology research has been documenting already quite in detail the various aspects of the livelihoods of Delta's inhabitants under the umbrella terms of living with floods, so including unstilled habitats, moving moving mostly by boat, having floating markets, developing cultures that are suitable for this environment in which water is ever present and initially perceived as a resource. However, the changing environmental conditions that have been discussed in several contributions of this report and previous reports, call for necessary adaptation of the farmers, either through on-site adaptations or migration, and that's what I'm going to try to discuss today in this presentation. So leading to this question of migration, just to give a few numbers, the Mekong Delta is the region out of all the economic region of the countries that has the highest out migration rate and the lowest net migration rate. In addition, those flows mostly head towards the Southeast region. So Ho Chi Minh City has a relatively high in-migration rate, and in particular, surrounding provinces around Ho Chi Minh City, in particular Binh Nhung province and Long Nai province, also receive a high share of in-migration. So that was to give you just key numbers as a socioeconomic profile of the region before to enter this question of how to assess vulnerability and adaptation from a social science perspective. So here I would like just to share basic definitions to present the understanding of this concept from this social science and in particular geography perspective. So risk being defined as the conjunction of a hazard, a natural hazard, a stake, so a population that is at stake in this specific territory, and a vulnerability, this population being vulnerable to this specific hazard. And the vulnerability is composed of the exposure, so the population being exposed to this hazard, the sensitivity, so this population being sensitive to this specific hazard's impact, and eventually the response capacity of this population. So one definition I like to use of vulnerability is the one shared by Cardona in 2003 that says that it is a physical, economic, political, or social susceptibility or predisposition of a community to damage in the case of a destabilizing phenomenon of natural or anthropogenic origin. So what I think is quite interesting in this specific definition is the fact that it emphasizes the multidimensionality of vulnerability, so physical, economic, political, or social, not only physical. And also the fact that the nature of the hazards that can cause vulnerability can be natural or anthropogenic. So in that perspective, vulnerability is perceived, it is subjective, and it is socially constructed. It is also dynamic, so it can change over time, and it is cumulative, so different dimensions of vulnerability combined. It's also multi-scale and can be assessed at different spatial scales. About adaptive capacity, in a very basic understanding of what adaptive capacity can be, if we follow the definition given by Adger, it is the ability to absorb a shock, to self-organize, and to adapt. So what is adaptation in that context? That can be defined like Brooks did in 2003 by adjustments in a system's behavior and characteristics that enhance its ability to cope with external stresses. So it's a very broad definition purpose. That means that it can apply to a system, either an individual, a group, a nation. It can include different types of adjustments. So it's a combination of different adjustments. And it can be in reaction to external stresses that are not specified. That means that it can be different types of stresses, and I'll try to illustrate that in the rest of the presentation. So you understood from what I said that the main question of this research has been to what extent can migration be considered as an adaptation strategy to environmental changes in the Mekong Delta. So on one side, to what extent does migration occur in reaction to environmental changes? And also, what are the impacts of migration on vulnerability? So we need to ask both of those questions in parallel. I'm going to try to present the content of the focus in a condensed way. First, there is a part that is dedicated more to literature review and the political international agenda on it. So I'll try to be more short on this part and to focus more on the second part, that is the presentation of the research I conducted in Vietnam between 2020 and 2022. So just in a few words, there has been a growing field of literature internationally on the question of migration and environment since the late 2000s. And it highlights in particular the multiplicity of migration factors and the ambiguity that can exist between economic factors and environmental factors in this migration decision. To quote only one research as a landmark, it's a Foresight project from 2011 that was based on multiple case studies around the globe, and that showed in particular the interactions between the multiple drivers of migration and the diverse impact that environmental change can have on migration. It can either foster migration or it can limit migration, so it goes both ways. Another interesting contribution of this project has been to shed light on the situation of trapped population, that is people for whom migration is not accessible, and so who are trapped on their original location. Another challenge in assessing migration and environment is the fact that it's very difficult to isolate from other type of migration. And so it's difficult to quantify. So it's difficult to apply quantitative methodology to it. That's why qualitative methodology is so valuable to get some knowledge about the reality of the situation. And final point on that is, in regard to these situations of trapped population, there has been also growing aspect of this literature that focuses more on immobility in the face of environmental change rather than mobility. So in parallel to this growing field of literature, there has been a priority, a real focus on the international political agenda put on this question of migration and environment as one of the key challenges to address. So just to mention a few initiatives, in 2012, there was a Nansen initiative that generated dedicated international cooperation platform on population displacements in the context of sudden and slow onset disasters, and a number of guidelines, very general, broad guidelines regarding how to address these questions in terms of public policy. Second, the United Nations in 2018 released the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which is a kind of frame document sharing guidelines internationally for international cooperation, in particular in the face of migration, and in particular environmental migration. So it's not only dedicated to environmental migration, but it does, the new thing about this specific document is that it does include environmental challenges as specific threats contributing to migration. And lastly, it's the Global Mayors Task Force on Climate and Migration that was generated by the C40 cities mayors who decided to join their strengths in collective effort to share knowledge and create a network around this question. So I try to go very quickly on that so I can share more points on my contribution to this field of literature after. There have been already a number of projects on migration and climate change, specifically in the Mekong Delta, combining qualitative or quantitative approaches over the past 15 years. And the results are in line with international literature. They highlight the tenuous link between environment and migration that can happen through the impact of environmental disturbance on livelihoods and farming incomes. The second point is that research tends to show in particular the importance of the socioeconomic and political context in addition to environmental changes, contributing to tipping points leading to migration trajectories. It shows that overall, given the diversity of the drivers of migration, migration might happen independently from environmental changes. and it can result from livelihood insecurities when they are put in perspective with opportunities, in particular in urban areas. Final point is that the temporality of the events matter, of the natural events. So sudden onset disaster and slow onset disaster have different consequences. And it seems that sudden onset disaster, such as flood or storms, can lead, are more likely to lead to migration than slow onset disaster, like sea level rise or drought. So I, on purpose, go fast in that so I can share with you this part that is the fieldwork I conducted between June 2020 and June 2022. So in continuity with this field of, this body of work on migration and environment, in particular in the Mekong Delta, I conducted fieldwork, a multi-site research with fieldwork in the departure area in Mekong Delta and in the destination area. I chose to study Ho Chi Minh City. So I focused on 2 districts in Ho Chi Minh City, in Go Vap and Binh Thanh districts, which are characterized by high numbers of internal rural migrants, but different population density and different type of urban fabric. And there in those 2 districts, in total, I met around 120 rural migrants during in-depth qualitative interviews. And among them, around half of them came from the Mekong Delta. On the other side, I also conducted 2 short-term fieldwork research in departure area. So you can see on the map, I focused on Binh Dai district in Ben Tre province. And then I went across Tanda district, My Sin district, and Tan Chi district in Sap Cheng province. The idea here was to observe different type of hazards, so more salinization on Binh Dai district, in particular with erosion, and more fresh flood, freshwater flood, on the left side of the west side of the district studied in Sap Cheng province. It was also a way to see different economic sectors, including rice farming, but also shrimp farming or coconut farming, for example, as well as industries. And those locations have a different distance to Ho Chi Minh City, which might be significant in terms of migration. So in those localities, I interviewed local authorities and mostly families of migrants and some return migrants. So I will present the key results that stand out from the ongoing analysis of this research in 3 main points. The first one is that environmental changes appear as an underlying factor in the migration decision that are often masked by economic factors. So most migrants I interviewed came from farming backgrounds, and they rarely in interviews, they rarely identify environmental hazards as migration factors. However, those environmental hazards do impact livelihood, and I will detail a little bit more how later. Migrants, but also their relatives and local authorities in departure areas all express the same reason to migrate. That's the main reason, that is insufficient incomes from the agricultural sector and lack of alternative job opportunities. And in order to understand this idea of insufficient income, we need to call to the relativity of the concept of poverty that can range from extreme precarity to poverty by comparison to others or to what could be achieved in reference to a certain standard of what is considered as acceptable or desirable in a certain moment in time. That means that migration occurs in various cases of households that are, of households that can benefit from very different economic capital. And again, returning to this idea of trapped population, that migration might not be accessible to everyone. So now to maybe go a step further in this analysis. So this is very much in line with other research that has been conducted in the Mekong Delta on this topic. From there, I wonder where do economic difficulties in the farming sector come from, those insufficient incomes that are mentioned. And from interviews again, I tend to group the different factors in three families. So first is the economic context that includes volatile selling prices and also inflation of input prices and variation of the demand. Second is the family of factors that we are mostly interested in this work is environmental changes, both from anthropogenic and natural origin. So I won't detail again the multiple environmental changes that are very well explained in depth in other focuses and chapters of this report, but I can, on the study sites I analyze, that can be salinization, disturbed flood patterns, repeated drought or erosion, and we can also add water pollution, in particular from industry or certain type of farming activities. The third family of factors is quite key, is the question of access to land, and in particular the reduction of the land surface for several family of farmers. This reduction can come from mechanical division of the plot of land through legacy. It can mean that the land has been eroded, or maybe that it has been reduced because of a development project, or quite commonly that part of the land might have been sold in order to deal with some times of economic difficulty. And to an extreme point, it can lead to landlessness when households have no more safety net, because usually land, in particular farming land, is a way to ensure food subsistence. It can be a guarantee for mortgage or for loan, and it can also be a legacy for children. I also need to mention mechanization, that of course the mechanization of the farming sector contribute to out-migration by reducing the demand for labor. But this goes both ways, because there is also a labor shortage that can come as a consequence of the out-migration. So these different factors, they combine to increase uncertainty and pressure for farmers. And you can see how this can especially impact small-scale farmers. I need to add another layer to this interpretation to include societal mutation as factors of migration, in particular since the rising of those migrations in the 1990s. So at the end of the 1980s, some technical changes allowed for migration to increase, so the softening of the whole resident registration system in particular, and in parallel, the development of the transportation system. So those are two key transformations that made it possible for migration flow to increase. And in the meantime, the promotion of urban lifestyles and the diffusion of international urban cultural references, promoting an idea of modernity that is associated to city by opposition to rural farming lands, also contribute to the appeal of the city, in particular for young people. And in that context, choosing to migrate might mean accessing more choices and diversity. Finally, we cannot ignore the growing importance of education and the expansion the expansion of education policies that also generate, lead to a generation shift between older generation for whom it might have been more difficult to access education, and younger generation who have a wider portfolio of options. So these are summarized in this first graph. We can see that environmental changes are not the only reason for migrating, nor the ultimate or proximate cause, because they often take a part in migration decisions, but those decisions take place within economic and social dynamics that can feed population aspiration to upward social mobility. And for some, this might seem unachievable if they stay in the farming sector in the Delta. However, I need to mention as well that given the future climate projection, the direct impact of environmental change threatening direct personal safety or housing is likely to increase. So more quickly, I will go faster on this second point, is that out migration from the Delta replaces or complements on-site adaptation strategies, like, for example, have been discussed last week. So I try to group them in different families, again, of strategies. So one can be to change activity within the primary sector in order to adapt to this changing condition, environmental one, but also social and economic ones. On the study sites I went to, that could mean to switch from rice to shrimp farming, leading to high profit, but also to high risk, to develop fruit cultivation, in particular coconut, but being dependent on the variability of the demand and the profit, or getting employed in the food processing industry, but that doesn't mean escaping vulnerability from the environmental point of view, because it's still dependent on environmental conditions in the Delta. So that was about changing activity within the primary sector. And then another strategy can be to turn away from food production and food processing locally. So that can mean for people who have enough capital to develop small-scale entrepreneurship, or to join the construction sector, but that can result in irregular scheduling income, and that can be dangerous. And this is not accessible to older generation as well. So the point here is to see that not all these options are accessible to capital poor households, that is households which have limited land and financial and social capital. And many local employment options provide irregular incomes and working schedules inaccessible to older generations. However, another option is to get employed in the local industry through short distance migration. So that can be temporary or secular or pendular migration through towards industrial zones that are located within the Mekong Delta. So one point is that the salaries in those industrial zones are still lower than the ones in Ho Chi Minh City area and Binh Nhung and Hon Ai province in particular. However, it's intra-district, inter-district, and inter-province migration within the Mekong Delta tend to absorb part of the out-migration. But one point of attention here is that industrial zones and local urban centers in development within the Delta still remain in subsidence and sea level rise exposed area. Therefore, they are exposed to risk of submersion on the long run. And we already see some issues with flooding in some industrial zones in the Delta. So there is a key challenge in considering the long-term sustainability of this transition in order to optimize the use of investment. So in the focus, I also talk about two other types of strategies that I won't develop here, which is building productive infrastructure locally to adapt, or relocation procedure for people at risk. So this is maybe more explained in the focus and in all the contribution as well of the report. So I won't spend time on that here, as it is a little bit further away from the question of migration. Here is a representation of the different results I just presented. So on the left part, you have the multiple disruptive factors that combine in generating insufficient incomes in particular. And on the right side, you have the different adaptation strategies that I just mentioned. In green, those are on-site adaptation strategies. And in light blue, you have migration, including towards Ho Chi Minh City, but other type of migration I do not study that are other provinces, not Southeast region, and abroad. Here, the most important thing to say is that you have the plain arrow, the full arrows that represent direct causal chain, and the dashed arrows, they represent indirect causal chain. So you have some causal chains that goes through the impact on farming sector leading to adaptation. And then you have more direct causal chain that lead directly from a disruptive factor to an adaptation strategy. And that mostly come from environmental changes and societal mutation, who can lead also independently to migration. So there is one last bit of this chart that I would like to explain, and that is the focus on migration outside the Mekong Delta. That because there are some limits to migration as adaptation that I would like to present. Indeed, migration, in particular for low-skilled rural migrants who arrive to the city only with only resource and skill is to farm, for those categories of people, migration can lead potentially to multidimensional vulnerability, even though the situations are very diverse. When I say multidimensional vulnerability, what I mean behind that is different types, dimensions of vulnerability through working conditions, housing conditions, from having to face high cost of renting and living in the city, leading to precarious housing conditions. Sometimes we can face some cases of precarious social isolation. And finally, for people who used to benefit from social and financial public help in their hometown, they might lose this help by migrating. So overall, it's a quite precarious situation. And this is something, the fragility of this balance that migrants built in the city, we saw mostly during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and the consequences of the lockdown and social distancing measures on rural migrants population. Because we saw that there have been a lot of dismissals in the industrial sector, the social distancing interruption, social distancing measure led to the interruption of the street vending activities. And that concluded in massive return migration flows after the reopening of the city. That's what leads me to, that's my last point, as a result, to understand those migration as long-term temporary migration, because they tend to lead to a return to their hometown. So one key element in that is that it's extremely difficult to access land ownership in the city due to land market prices. And migrants tend to stay until their physical condition does not allow them anymore to work in the city. So houses and farming lands are kept and maintained by relatives in their hometown, and then migrants might return to their hometown and resume subsistence farming. But one question is, how durable are those strategies given land availability and current environmental trends in the Mekong Delta, as I mentioned earlier? So to conclude, I'd like to mention three main points critical points where uncertainty can turn into insecurity and that could be addressed through public policy. So first is the importance of communication and information in order to spread awareness among farmers on the possible future environmental scenarios in the Mekong Delta in the medium or long term. Because what seems to stand out from this fieldwork is that the changes observed in the environment through their impact on the harvest are not always perceived as long-term and inexorable by farmers. The adaptations that are implemented by households are often with limited resources on a short-term basis locally. And there is a mismatch between the time frame of migration that happens over a few years or a few decades and the time frame of climate change. So here there is a key challenge in making sure that the understanding of that local population understand the different time frame of the information that is shared. Second is to continue to support population in the Delta through promoting the development of alternative sectors, like it's already been done, through employment and professional training, in parallel to agriculture and aquaculture sector. And here, what I would like to emphasize is the importance to target this development towards young people, but also older generation, for which it is more difficult today to access employment in the Mekong Delta. It's also important to maintain and reinforce livelihood support policies in departure areas, and especially to target landless farmers, as we saw that they are more vulnerable to different types of shocks in the Delta. And finally, but most importantly, it seems to be very important to support, to implement support in destination area in order to accompany rural migrants. And this can be done via dedicated public support structures in order to ensure safe access to job, housing, public school, and public healthcare in the city, and in Ho Chi Minh City in particular, but also in surrounding provinces, in order to prevent that migrant would enter urban poverty. So to conclude, for capital poor households of the Delta, the uncertainty that is generated by environmental change, it adds up with uncertainty on the agricultural market. And in that context, migration can be interpreted as an attempt to cope with and reduce that uncertainty. Today, it's still difficult to identify clearly this link between climate change and migration because, as we saw, it is very entangled with other economic and social transformation. However, given the projected increase of the impact of climate change on the Delta, environment is likely to play a growing role in the migration decision. So providing safe conditions for migration on multiple scales in space, so short and long distances and in time, through commuting, circular, temporary, or permanent migration is very important in order to ensure a successful adaptation that allows households to reduce their vulnerability and to limit that uncertainty. So I hope I kept my time. Thank you very much for your attention, and feel free to ask for questions or specification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. So time is running fast. We now move on to the discussion part with Sylvie. Sylvie, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you, Marie-Noël. Thank you, Clara, for inviting me to discuss your presentation. So I'd like to, I will present two things. The interesting things of your work, and I would make some comments on to perhaps improve your work, and I have some questions to you after. So this study questioned to what extent migration can be considered as an adaptation strategy to environmental change in the Mekong Delta. So that it's a very strong key question, which help Clara to avoid the tricky narrative of the concept of migration as a strategy to environmental or climate change. Because this narrative has been developed since 2010 during the Cancun Adaptation Framework, the COP21, where migration were considered as an adaptive strategy to climate change for people living in vulnerable areas. And it was considered no longer as a failure of adaptation policies. So it means like adaptation could be on the shoulder of the people living in vulnerable areas. So this narrative on climate change overestimates the role of migration instead of local adaptation strategy like economic diversification, agricultural change, resilient habitat, social network that have to be implemented by political authority. So this narrative are embedded in the management policy of vulnerable countries to climate change, like in Bangladesh, for example, where some authors demonstrate how the discourse of migration as a strategy for climate change adaptation has emerged. And according to some of those authors, climate change could be, what they call climate migration could be an opportunity to free up labor for the garment export sector, which led to facilitate agrarian dispossession for shrimp farming in the tidal zone. And the idea in Bangladesh is to speed up the urban transition and the industrial transition. And that, for me, it's one of the points to be developed is how the increasing narrative on vulnerability of the Mekong Delta is a way for to speed up the economic transition of Vietnam, to increase the industrial transition and free up the land dispossession in the Delta for larger enterprise. So the idea is no longer to to sustain the small subsistence farming, but to free up the young labor. And there is no policy in Vietnam to increase the labor productivity of this agrarian sector. So for me, it's a very political way of understanding this narrative, but it's a bit tricky in Vietnam because the government still don't want too many young people to go to migrate to cities. So there is like ambivalence in their agricultural policy versus industrial policy. So that is the first thing, is how to avoid this tricky narrative. And I think that Clara did well, that she didn't speak about environmental migration, but migration where environmental drivers can be part of other, entangle with other drivers. The second thing is, what I find interesting in her work is to study at the same time the arrival and departure areas to better understand the level of economic, social, and environmental vulnerability of migrants and their family. So, and she demonstrates the limit of migration as an adaptive strategy because it can lead to multidimensional vulnerability in urban areas. And she showed how the pandemic increased this vulnerability, and show how during the lockdown, migration are not a sustainable strategy for adaptation to economic, social, and environmental change. And she set up like a new concept of long-term temporary migration, which is interesting. And the third thing she addressed is how environmental drivers of migration are very difficult to measure and address, and even migrants don't identify them as relevant drivers. So it's led to a critical analysis of the concept of environmental migration. So that are the three things that I found very interesting in your presentation. But I think there is a strong political bias in your study. First, how can we understand the following paradox? How can we explain that the Rice Bowl of Vietnam are the highest immigration rate in the country? So perhaps it is linked to the less labor-intensive agriculture system the government wants to develop, because, I mean, what we say the government is we are in a neoliberal state where agriculture policy depend on the external market system. So the fact that the Mekong Delta is now the Rice Bowl of Vietnam, we have to understand in a historical way how agriculture was developed in Mekong Delta during the colonial time, the French colonial time, to feed the French colonies. Okay, so it's that the very big difference between Red River Delta and Mekong Delta. So we need to go back to the history and understand the heavyweight Mekong Delta agricultural system have to wait for understanding now the difficulty of diversification of agriculture to diversification of agriculture with a very high labor potential. In the Red River Delta, we have got more than 1,000 people per square kilometer, and Mekong Delta is less than the half. So there is an historical background to understand. And And so I think it's very difficult to address the issue of the vulnerability of environmental and economic condition without questioning the choice of the government. I mean, the policy, the agriculture policy, the industrial policy. So that is the first thing. The second thing, I think, you don't emphasize enough the particularity of deltas, even if you say that you have addressed slow and slow and rapid onset. I think you don't make enough link between the fact that the delta is, I mean, this paradox of very rich, a lot of resources in the delta and a lot of vulnerabilities linked to the hazards. And I think it's not, the issue is not the hazards, it's how, what you say that the living with flood, strategy or livelihood of the people is putting at stake by a system of development of the management of the hydraulics, the management of the upstream valley, and also the development of urbanization and road management, and how the living with flood system is really putting at stake by a new system of management, which don't take into account the specific of the delta. And the third thing, I think for me, it's important, it's also its historical aspect is the Mekong Delta is a frontier, is a migration frontier. It has been developed, I mean, the settlement has been speed up during the colonial era, and we have to take that into account, that the settler in the Mekong Delta, they were a pioneer, and so there is a kind of capacity or perhaps a way of life of moving, of migrating, of displacement, which is very different from the Red River Delta, where the anchorage of the population in their village is very high. And so the fact that you've got a lot of young people who are moving back, who go from their hometown to industrial areas and they go back, I mean, it's also a kind of livelihood, which I think could be more in-depth studied, because it's not the same thing that in the north. So I think that these three aspects of the historic background, the politic background, and the very dynamic system of siltation and of water management that we have been developed in the other focus could be better interrelated. I think for your thesis, I know that during a presentation is a bit difficult. So the political aspect, I just want to give you one example for Counter, the Department of Construction of Counter, I heard, has stopped the floating market of Counter because they are putting hard engineering along the riverbed to better protect the city. So it's a political choice to increase the hard engineering and not the living with flood and economic market on the rivers. So this top-down policy put at stake a system which is very economic, on the economic point, is very integrating rural areas. So I'd like to ask you, during your interviews with the population in the two districts you studied, did the people speak about how some policies have changed their livelihood? Or what do they think of the policy of transition from agriculture to shrimp farming? That is, it's the first question. When and the second one is, how have you chosen your interviewer in the villages in the Mekong Delta? Have you made a link with the population you met in Ho Chi Minh City and get back to their hometown, or did you went to this village by either through a relationship, by chance? Okay. So it's for me, it's a bit difficult to ask you question because for me I think to improve your work, which I found very interesting, and you were very courageous to change a bit the subject of your thesis, because this concept of migration as adaptation strategy is very tricky. It's difficult to change the scale of my presentation. So what I think is there are three things which has to be more developed. It's the political aspect and the historical aspect. And after, there is the issue of downscaling those issues on to better put your interviews in a specific context. Okay, so I hope it can help, or my presentation was understandable.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sylvie. Go on, Clara.
Yes, maybe I answer quickly to your different points. Thank you for those insights, and I totally agree with the necessity to emphasize more those different dimensions. As you said, of course, the time of the presentation also is limited, but it's also something that I need to personally investigate more. So there is this dimension of the systemic functioning of the data that I definitely need to involve more. And to answer specifically on the mobility practice in the Delta and the historical dimension that shapes this mobility practice in the Delta, I think here I mentioned internal migration within the Delta and migration towards Ho Chi Minh City, but to be totally exhaustive, of course, I would also need to include international migration in this total panorama of the different migration practices, and that can be migration between the Mekong Delta, the Vietnamese side of the Mekong Delta, and Cambodia, also migration towards Thailand as well. And to some extent, there is also now the policies of labor exploitation that are implemented in several areas of the Delta, exportation towards international, to other countries of East Asia in particular. So that would make a more complete overview of the different destinations, in particular as they can be, to some extent, even though they happen in very different modalities, they can be interpreted for some of them in similar, through the similar grid. About political dimension that you mentioned, when you mentioned the example of Canter, indeed, the floating market of Canter is being moved or displaced or reduced by the development of the riverbank. So part of it was already funded previously by the World Bank, and now the new section of it is being funded by the French Agency for Development. And this is a good example to see how the objective of environmental protection here is also, so the fight against erosion in particular is combined with the objective of urban development, and how it's both go in the same direction of combining those two objectives in a way to also maximize also investment, attract fundings, and guarantee the implementation of development projects as this one in particular. And this, of course, leads to always challenging questions in how to implement the relocation procedure, and in particular for population like this who would have to displace or totally change livelihood. So that's a very quick answer. About shrimp farming, you asked me the impact of policy on livelihood, and especially the fostering of the shrimp farming industry. There is a sort of dual way of fostering shrimp farming in order to adapt to increased salinity rates, and at the same time going in this direction of developing shrimp farming for the higher profit that it brings in comparison to rice farming. So there can also be this idea of fostering maybe the use of salty water brackish water, in order to speed up the process of development of the shrimp farming. But this is very unequal, since shrimp farming also requires high investments and is very risky for each round. So the impact is very different depending on each household. So you would have households with higher capital who may have benefited a lot from this transition and increased considerably wealth from this transition, and other households who might be excluded from this transition from not having the initial capital, and other incomes who might have had this capital but who got unlucky, since especially they have to deal with a very high risk of disease and lost their savings from doing that transition as well. So the trajectories can be very, very different depending on each house.
Sorry, just one point I think it would be interesting to address is to compare with what's happening in Bangladesh. Because there, the policy is really to free up very dense delta of GBM from the overwhelming population, okay? So it's to choose activities which don't require a high level of labor, okay? And it's what's happening in Vietnam. So the idea is, how can we keep a high population in the Delta is false. It's just the policy is to free up the land and to have large agricultural perimeter with large investment, okay, and not to keep the population. So I think we have to see the issue on the other side. What are the policies? What are their challenges? What are their objectives? And the impact, and the way to say that environmental problem, climate change are putting at risk the population, it's a way to hide, according to me, the real objective of the agriculture and industrial policy in Vietnam. It's my point.
I agree that the interpretation in regard to public policy is quite ambivalent, because there is a double discourse at the same time of in the national guidelines who foster, as you say, this try to limit officially this migration, and still really reinforce this objective of keeping population in rural areas. However, at the same time, there might not be so many tools available, especially for local government level, to implement that policy. And in this way, migration is very useful to balance, to match the location of the population and the location for labor demands. So mechanization in that is also mechanization of farming is also going in that direction. And for several local populations, local governments, sorry, there is this dual positioning of saying at the same time that yes, they would try to keep some of the young people in particular, because in some specific sector, like coconut, for example, it can lead to shortage of labor. But at the same time, it's a very good opportunity that migrants would rather go where they could find more easily job and then send back remittances, supporting the departure area in this way, rather than staying where local authorities and local market in current conditions are not able to provide enough job offer. So there is always this double positioning that do not exclude each other, but it's two perspectives that are combined at the same time, I think.
I'm sorry, I have to be. I'm sorry, I have to be timekeeper because it's already the end of the session. I would like to thank both of you for Clara for your very interesting presentation, and Sylvie for your very interesting and useful comments. And I hope that maybe you will continue to exchange between you to improve Clara's work. Maybe we can just take. There was one question in the chat concerning the use of satellite observation to help you in your field, Clara. The questions are a bit long, so I'm sorry if other people in the audience have other questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to take more today. Maybe you can just make a brief answer, or Sylvie also. And I guess the question might be for both of you.
Yes. Sorry, I was reading the full question. So how to combine social demography or urban development studies with Earth observation data? So yes, it is very useful for me in particular to use Earth observation data to see the evolution in particular of departure areas. So comparing the satellite images of different time frames can really inform the moment where the switch happened, in particular in rice and for example. And in terms of the arrival area, it's also a way to see the urban front expand. So to have a visual idea of the expansion and the densification of the city, and that of course inform migration, even though it's not as clear as what statistic could be, even as the statistics are still imperfect as well to grasp this phenomenon. However, satellite image can also be tricky to use in order to question this migration aspect in the city, because it can inform about in-migration when the city has been expanding. However, now, like for example, the pandemic, the departure of rural migrants cannot be grasped at all through satellite image, because of course, the rental rooms stay now that they have been built for to answer to that housing demand. They do stay, and the fact that most of them remain empty for a few months in 2021 cannot be grasped at all through satellite image. So there is always a certain caution to keep in combining this use of satellite image, in particular in terms of urbanization with social methodologies, sociological methodology. I don't know if I answered to the full question or if there were more things in the question. Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting methodological point to bring up.
I'm really sorry because I see there are other questions, but we are nearly 10 minutes late, so we have to close here. So thank again everyone for being here today. Thank you to Clara and to Sylvie. To end this session, I just would like to remind you our next session, which will be on the 5th of May, and which will be on integrated prospective assessment of climate impacts, adaptation strategies, and net zero strategies. The presentation will be made by Etienne Espagne, who is senior economist at the World Bank and former responsible for the GEM Vietnam project at AFD. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you will join again for the next session. Have a nice end of day and goodbye.
Have a nice day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. And for all questions who have not been able to discuss, we can also still discuss by email. I would be more than happy to share more on this topic.
Thank you, Clara.